Welcome everybody to the third module in the social policy for development planners in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic course. In this module, we introduce an important aspect of how we understand the diversity of social policy types. This is important for policy making and how we think about the varieties of social policy frameworks. It concerns the clustering of social policy types that clearly delineates the diversity of the norms and the methods of social provisioning that underpin a particular social policy design. The effect of the clustering or the classification of social policy types is that it introduces us to the idea of social policy architecture, the understanding of the dominant ethos that frame social policy in a given context. And this relates to the dominant normative underpinning of social policy in practice, which highlights the relative coherence within the systems of the design and implementation of social policy. It highlights what is considered the desirable norms that underpin the social policy architecture, the rules of eligibility and access to social services and social provisioning, and how social services are delivered, the generosity of the provisions, and so on. Within the social policy literature, this is understood as welfare regimes. The nature of a country's social policy architecture, the coverage, the rules of eligibility, the institutional framework for provisioning, the funding vehicles, whether it's tax, social insurance, or donor support, and the generosity of income replacement will have implications for how a country can respond to the impact of COVID-19 on lives and livelihood. The extent to which the population in a given context is visible and accessible for pre-pandemic social policy architecture and social provisioning will impact the speed and efficiency with which a country can respond to external shocks such as the pandemic. As Claire Bambra notes, and I quote, "Welfare state modeling has long been an important strand within comparative social policy, serving as a means of reducing the complexity of cross-national welfare state provisioning. Even in the context that may not be clearly understood as rising to the level of a welfare state, the design and implementation modalities of social policy can be quite diverse and complex across territories. The objective of clustering and highlighting the dominant and salient aspects of a social policy framework is to reduce the complexity of social policy in practice. Generally, the criteria for classifying social policy types or welfare regimes are diverse. These have ranged from addressing the how they do it question, in other words, question about how they do it, to the question of how much and the institutional characteristics of the welfare systems, the mechanisms for delivering welfare, up to including the gender order and the norms that underpin social policy provision. The how they do it question generally speaks to the modalities for funding the social policy provisioning. It matters whether the social policy is funded through tax, social insurance, or private insurance, and whether the tax-funded component of social policy provision is universal or selective. In other words, universal in the sense that it covers the whole population, or selective in the sense that it covers a designated segment of the population that is chosen on the basis of certain criteria. The how they do it question will relate to the rules that define how those who are eligible can access the social provision. In other words, what we will call the eligibility criteria. For a while, the issue of how much dominated the classification of social policy types. This has two distinct and sometimes unrelated components. The first involves indicators based on the share of social expenditure in a country's gross domestic product. In other words, what share of the GDP of a country is accounted for by social services, education, health, and so on and so forth. As we mentioned in Module 2, within the framework of the social statistics that the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, uses, public spending on education is not included in the composition of social expenditure data. A separate way of addressing the how much question is related to the replacement rate, what we call replacement rate of income maintenance measures. In other words, where there's a loss of income as a result of unemployment or illness and so on and so forth, how much of the initial income earned by the individual is replaced by, say, for instance, unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, and so on and so forth. The institutional characteristics of the welfare system relate to both the selection criteria as well as the way the delivery of social welfare is organized. The institutional features concern whether social welfare, education, healthcare, housing, public transport, etc., and so on and so on, is organized through public infrastructure or private companies, whether it's organized through public entities or through private enterprises. It also concerns whether something such as social care, childcare, old age care are delivered through public institutions or through private enterprises or delivered through unpaid family support. The selection criteria acts back to the idea of eligibility criteria that we mentioned earlier on. Again, the concern is whether the services are provided to everybody within a given territory without discrimination, or is based on predetermined selective criteria. The former would be considered universal access, while the latter would be regarded as selective. Here, a distinction must be made where coverage for the social provision is categorical. In other words, for instance, child support or old age support services are categorical in that they are explicitly based on age-limited criteria. Child support is meant to support children. Old age support is meant to support people who are old age, in old age. One has to be legally a child or an older person to qualify for child support or social pension. This is separate from whether every child or older person is entitled to the claim. In other words, where you provide child support and every child in the territory is entitled, we'll be talking about universal child support. Where you provide social pension and everybody in the territory is eligible, you'll be talking about universal social pension. The alternative, of course, is that entitlement to, say, child support or social pension may be based on some form of means test. In other words, you look at the income level of the caregiver for the child or the older person who is the beneficiary, and on the basis of a predetermined threshold of income or assets, you say that those who are above that threshold are not qualified. That's a selective criteria based on means testing. An essential and vital classification criterion for social policy or welfare regimes types that feminist scholars and activists introduced mainly in the 1990s was a focus on the gender ordering. In other words, a way in which gender defines access and eligibility to welfare provision. This reflects the gender norms that underpin social policy architecture. For instance, is the underlying normative assumption of the social policy architecture one that assumes that women are homemakers and men are breadwinners? Or is it one that frames access based on active labor market participation of women and non-gender specific engagement in domestic care activities? In other words, men and women are expected to be responsible for what do you call it, domestic work. In the construction of welfare or social policy regime types, the classification technique may be based on typologies or taxonomies, and it's important to separate these two. Typologies are generally conceptual classification intended to generate what is called ideal type cases. The most common method used in such a classification process is cluster analysis, using quantitative variables to generate the cluster. The analysis will produce what we may call ideal type cases of clusters, to which real existing cases or countries or real practices or countries' welfare systems are essentially approximate. They're separate from the ideal type. They approximate the ideal types, but they are not based on the direct observation of the countries' individual welfare system practices. The three world welfare state regime clusters that Espin Anderson produced is a case of welfare regimes based on typologies derived from cluster analysis. In this model, we will discuss two examples of such typologies, one by Espin Anderson and the other by Tandika Mkandawire. Most of the classification efforts that emerged in the wake of Espin Anderson's 1990 work is of this type, their typologies. But a different method of producing clusters or social policy regime is based on taxonomy. Unlike typologies, taxonomies are based on direct observation and clustering of countries or welfare types based on such methods of direct observation. Rather than approximates of ideal types, in the case of typologies, in taxonomies, countries are direct representations of the clusters. Most of the feminist responses to Espin Anderson's 1990 work and Jeremy Sikin's efforts that we will discuss later in this module are examples of taxonomy type classification. Some of the earliest social policy types discussed in the literature are taxonomies of how welfare, social welfare is delivered and the eligibility criteria that frame access and benefits. Richard Titmuss, who was a leading scholar of social policy based at the LSE from the 1950s to 1973 when he passed away, made a distinction between eligibility based on universal or selective access. As we mentioned before, universal provisioning will involve affording access to everyone without discrimination to the social service. In the case of categorically defined provisioning, say child or old age, every child or older person will be eligible to receive the benefit. The same will apply to benefits based on needs, say unemployment or ill health. Selective access, on the other hand, involves limiting access to social services or the benefit based on eligibility that can be defined as a result of application of means testing. In this context, only people below a particular income level or with assets below a predetermined level will be eligible to access the benefit or service. But selective techniques may also involve what is called proxy means testing. In other words, you use something else to estimate the resources available to people, geographical, particular local government or particular area is, predetermined, is determined that to be high in poverty rate, for instance, or you have a situation where communities are asked to select from among themselves people who should benefit from based on lack of resources. This is it's a form of proxy means test, which itself points to how administratively expensive and difficult means testing can be. In some cases, the selection is delegated to community level, where community members are asked to determine who among them should qualify for accessing the service of the benefit. Such means test is used in contexts where income-based means test is difficult. In many instances, selective provisioning of services and benefits are designed to impose significant stigma of beneficiaries so that it will discourage those who are considered not to be entitled from coming forward to claim access to the thing. The removal of stigma is often a major driving force for universal provisioning. In other words, the stigma associated with access to public provision. Means testing to determine eligibility are also usually very intrusive, and as I said earlier on, administratively costly. The level of intrusion into private affairs alone is often enough to discourage many from claiming or even coming forward to claim. In his 1959 classic collection of essays titled Essays on Welfare States, Richard Titmuss distinguished between, which is a further method, of classification of social policy provisioning, distinguished between what he calls social welfare, fiscal welfare, and occupational welfare. Social welfare, or something better classified as public welfare, involves social services and benefits provided by public authorities or the state. This will range from healthcare services to education and income maintenance benefits. The provision could be based on universal access, or it could be selective. The institutional framing of the social policy provision is that it is provided by public authorities. Fiscal welfare, on the other hand, refers to benefits that are generally provided by the tax authorities, something that most people do not readily appreciate as part of the system of social policy or social welfare provisioning, but which, in the words of Titmuss, are nonetheless intended to meet specific needs. This will include tax rebates or tax credits covering a range of needs. Child benefits tax credits, for instance, tax credit for private health insurance or pension fund or provident fund contribution are examples of what Titmuss refers to as fiscal welfare. Occupational welfare are generally welfare benefits that accrue to individuals based on their employment and are usually provided by employers or employing units or enterprises. Again, unlike public welfare, occupational welfare is not something that we immediately think of as part of the social welfare apparatus of a country. Occupational welfare covers a range of employment-linked benefits intended to meet specific needs. A measure of social or private health insurance involves contribution by the employer to the social insurance premium, or in the explicit provision of non-insurance based healthcare. In other words, where the employer provides healthcare support. Other benefits may include pay-as-you-go retirement benefits or employers' contributions to the pension or provident fund account of an individual employee, support for the education of the children of employees, clothing allowance, etc. The salient point that Titmuss makes in the chapter on the social division of welfare is that fiscal and occupational welfare have different implications for redistribution and inequality, whereas public, universally accessible social services and provisioning are likely to reduce inequality. The other categories of welfare, in particular occupational welfare, tend to deepen inequality. And the level of health insurance option and contributions are generally linked to pay grade of the individual employees. In other words, the salary scale, the what do you call it, employment status of the individual. I'm sure that when we consider the peculiar nature of fiscal and occupational welfare to which we depend, it is easy to understand that the idea that Africa is a welfare state-free region would be as absurd. In the posthumous collection of essays, Social Policy and Introduction, Titmuss further identified 3 models of social policy, what he called models of social policy. These are the residual welfare, the industrial achievement performance welfare, and the institutional redistributive welfare. In cases of residual welfare, public provision is provided only in instances of demonstrable inability of the individual to provide for himself or herself. And as Titmuss noted, and I quote, this formulation is based on the premise that there are 2 natural or socially given channels through which an individual's needs are properly met: the private market or the family. Only when these break down should social welfare institution come into play, and then only temporarily, end of quote. In this case, the first port of call for individuals to provide for themselves is through the market of family support. Only in the demonstrable instances of market failure in social provisioning will the public authorities provide support. Beneficiaries are often expected to graduate out of the programs. The residual approach is intimately linked to the deployment of selectivity in accessing services or benefits. Titmuss' industrial achievement performance model is closely related to his earlier idea of occupational welfare. This model, to quote him, incorporates a significant role for social welfare institutions as adjunct to the economy. It holds that social needs should be met based on merit, work performance, and productivity. The third model that Titmuss identified is what he referred to as, and I quote, the institutional redistributive model of social policy. To quote him, this model sees social welfare as a major integrated institution in society, providing universalist services outside of the market on the principle of need. It is in part based on theories about the multiple effects of social change and the economic system, and in part on the principle of social equality. End of quote. A central normative inspiration for the institutional redistributive model of social policy is the social nature of factors that adversely impact on the welfare of individuals in society, or what Titmuss refers to as diswelfares. For instance, social progress and significant advances in manufacturing capacity has led to a vast number of cars on our road. Vehicles emit pollutants that can affect the health of individuals, affect the lungs, and so on and so forth. And Titmuss will argue that the adverse diswelfare of illness that is created by vehicles on the road, which is as a result of social change and social progress and so on and so, should be borne collectively by society rather than by the individuals who fall ill because they're just in society, because they're on the street, because they're, what do you call it, in the city. They didn't create the what do you call it, the pollutant. The pollutant itself is a result of vehicles being manufactured, vehicles being used, and so on and so forth. In other words, the diswelfare of adverse health condition should not be allowed to, in his words, lie where it falls. In other words, it should not be social responsibility of individuals. That's just an example of diswelfare to individuals, which is as a result of social collective factors. An important distinction between the models of social policy that Titmuss proposed and the classification types that developed subsequently is that Titmuss model can coexist within a single country. And they may be applied for inter-country, or what we may call comparative social policy, but they can be used also in terms of the assessment or the analysis of social policy types within a particular country. While social classification existed before Espen Andersen's three worlds of welfare capitalism, the construction of typologies and taxonomies for comparative social welfare regime exploded following the publication of Espen Andersen's book. As mentioned earlier, Espen Andersen's classification is a work of typology and a product of cluster analysis. It became a seminal work in the field of comparative social policy or welfare analysis. And Espen Andersen suggests three distinct welfare regime clusters. These are the liberal, the corporatist or conservative, and the social democratic welfare state regime. Among the main criteria for classification that Espen Andersen used are what he called decommodification, the idea that the degree of access to social provision is based on social rights linked to citizenship or residence, and the degree of the elimination of market dependence for welfare provision. The second is what they call social stratification. The social policy regime is not merely a reflection of social stratification, but can deepen or reduce social stratification. In other words, social hierarchies in society that, what do you call it, a social welfare, welfare regime either deepens, reinforces, or mitigates or reduces. And then the third is the extent of state, market, family mix in the organization of the provisioning of welfare. The liberal regime takes the market or family as the first port of call in securing social provision. Social policy is dominated by individual market-based social insurance, tax-subsidized private plans, either health or old age income maintenance. Public assistance is usually means-tested and stigmatized. In the post-1980 period, this model or approach to social policy design has become dominant among international multilateral organizations and bilateral donor agencies. We will discuss this further in Module 4. The approach to public social policy is mostly often residual in the way in which Richard Titmuss spoke about it. The degree of the decommodification is small. Stratification is maintained and deepened, and the state promotes the market as the primary source of welfare provisioning. This is often supported by tax subsidy, or what Titmuss refers to as fiscal welfare. The corporatist or conservative regimes favor social insurance-based entitlements, which are linked to employment status and class. Welfare entitlements are generally forced directed at groups whose cooperation in economic modernization and nation building are deemed indispensable for the state. It aligns with Titmuss' industrial achievement performance model. Social insurance-based entitlement is linked to income levels, and benefits are earnings related. In other words, they are based on earnings. Social insurance may be in separate pools. Private insurance, however, is marginal in these regimes, unlike the liberal regimes. Others refer to the corporatist welfare regime as the Bismarckian regime, associated with the social insurance-based welfare reforms pioneered by the government of Otto von Bismarck in Germany in the 1880s. In the specific context, the regime preserves traditional family model. The Bismarck regime preserved, the corporatist, welfare regime preserves the traditional family model of male breadwinner and was influenced by social conservatism of the church in Europe. And then the third welfare regime or welfare state regime that Espen Andersen identified in his cluster analysis and typology construction is the social democratic welfare regimes. which is generally identified with universal provision of decommodified services and benefits, which seeks to incorporate and secure the allegiance of the middle class. It is concerned with promoting equality of access to quality social services and preemptively aims to socialize, in other words, where society bears the cost of family having to provide for care, from childcare to social care for the elderly. The social democratic regime is anchored on full employment, and the social insurance it embodies is of a national insurance type rather than separate pools of funds. The regime is concerned with reducing social stratification and promoting social mobility of lower classes while addressing inequalities in gender relations. In specific contexts, it is associated with active promotion of gender equality and dual earner family model. In other classifications, such as that by Walter Koppe and Joachim Palmer, the social democratic regime is a close approximation of what they call the encompassing welfare regime. The emphasis in the latter is on the comprehensive nature of coverage of social provisioning that is universal and addresses the vagaries of the market and family life cycle from what we may call cradle to grave. There have been subsequent attempts to identify other social policy regime types or models to refine Espin-Anderson classifications or provide alternative framing of social policy regimes based on substantial disagreements with him on the classification criteria. In cases of the latter, the feminist critique of Espin-Anderson has been based on the gender norms that underpin a welfare regime and the take on care economy. Other models that have been highlighted are what we may call the productivist or Confucian model associated with East Asian countries. In this context, the focus is on raising the productive capacity of citizens in the developmental objectives of the in which the developmental objective of the country takes precedence. Welfare provisioning is often provided by employing firm or enterprises, and the family plays a prominent role in social provisioning. The nationalist model has been identified in the African context. This is associated with an investment in human resource capacity through public funding of education, near universal access to healthcare, subsidies for agriculture, food, and pan-territorial pricing of goods and services. In other words, in which the price that is set for some goods and commodities across the country, regardless of the distance from the point of production or import. An essential dimension of the nationalist model is a focus on social policies, nation building, or social cohesion tasks. Welfare regimes, whether derived methodologically from a typology or a taxonomy, are better understood as approximate. Real existing models are best understood as welfare regime mix. that may have the characteristics of different welfare regimes. There are two significant efforts at identifying welfare or social policy regime types in Africa that are worth discussing further. One is by Jeremy Sikins, based in Cape Town, and the other by Thandika Mkandawure, the Malawian scholar who passed away in March 2020. Sikins' classification focuses on Latin America and Africa, while Mkandawure's classification focuses on Africa. Sikins derived a classification of three welfare regime types that he referred to as workerist, agrarian, and pauperist. The classification is based on five criteria, namely, 1, the nature of the economy; 2, the social character of the working class; 3, the nature of subaltern politics; 4, the nature and strategy adopted by the elite; and 5, the discourses and ideology that underpin the attitude towards social welfare. The economy that underpins the workerist welfare regimes, for instance, Sikins will argue, is import substitution industrialization, with the social characteristics of the working class being predominantly foreign immigrant workers. The nature of subaltern politics underpinning, it initially involved the extensive use of strikes, but this shifted subsequently to electoral politics, we will argue. The strategy of the elite was to incorporate the working class, was to co-opt the working class into the electoral politics, involving the integrating the working class into the dominant political and social systems. The ideological underpinning of the workerist regime may be corporatist or social democratic. The regime may involve, he argues, extensive use of social insurance scheme. The agrarian welfare regime that Sikins argued was characteristics of much of Africa involved the economy was primarily based on smallholder agriculture. The working class was predominantly made up of migrant workers from the rural areas who were expected to return to the peasant society. By the way, the workerist welfare regime, he will argue, was more reflective of Latin America. The nature of the subaltern politics in the context of what they call the agrarian welfare was popular anti-colonial. The elite strategy in this case, strategies by the colonialists, was predominantly one of indirect rule, followed by rapid decolonization, he will argue. The ideological underpinning was conservative or liberal. Much of the social provisioning was left to the family, and the post-employment income support primarily involved the use of provident fund rather than pension scheme. The third welfare regime that Sikins tagged as pauperist would seem to have developed much later. Its economic underpinning is export-oriented, non-smallholder commodity production. The character of the working class is workers made up of rural migrants who do not have any future of going back to being peasants. The mode of subaltern politics is what Sikins labeled as hidden forms of resistance, which was first unpacked by Robin Cohen, in the 1970s. but which subsequently morphed into electoral politics. In other words, from hidden forms of resistance to electoral politics. And the elite strategy, and I imagine here refers to post-colonial elite, uh, involve slow liberal decolonization, or, what do you call it, or the earlier colonial elite, and the ideological underpinning was liberal or neoliberal. A further refinement of the original classification, you can see on the screen now, involves the same three types of welfare regimes with 5 classification criteria. For instance, the peasantry was the focus of the agrarian welfare regimes, workers with the focus of what do you call it, um, the workerist welfare regime, and the poor the focus of the pauperist welfare regime. The incentive for constructing the welfare regimes also differ. The incentive in the case of the agrarian regime is to secure social stability, whereas ensuring industrial peace is the incentive for the workerist welfare regime, while social stability in non-democratic context or gaining electoral victory in the context of liberal democracy is the incentive for the pauperist welfare regime. The objective of the agrarian regime, he argued, is development, while the workerist welfare regime is concerned with smoothing the income of the beneficiaries. In each of the regimes, the role of the family, formal wage employment, and the state differ. While the role of the family in the agrarian regime was central, it is marginal in the other two regime types. Formal wage employment is marginal in the agrarian and pauperist regimes, but central in the workerist regime. Similarly, the role of the state is varied in the agrarian and workerist regimes, but central to the pauperist regimes. With regard to the nature of the dominant mode of solidarity in the welfare state, kinship, he will argue, defines agrarian welfare regime, while individual or corporate employment shape the workerist regime, and the pauperist regime is shaped by universal solidarity, mostly one presumes because the benefits of the poor are funded from the fiscus or donor financing. The dominant locus of solidarity, as he calls it, also varies between the regime types. Family is the locus of solidarity in the agrarian regime, while markets or the state defines the workerist regime, and the state undergirds the pauperist regime. When considered from the perspective of, I quote, the extent and direction of redistribution, this again is varied. Under the agrarian regime is low to the poor, but varied to the middle income groups in the workerist regime, and medium to high to the poor in the workerist, in the pauperist regime. In Mkandawire's classification of social welfare models, the concern is with the colonial legacy of welfare regimes. In this regard, Mkandawire builds the models on the taxonomy of Africa's macro regimes that Samir Amin published in 1972. In the publication, Amin identified 3 macro regimes, mainly what he called Africa of the colonial trade economy, which is largely associated with West Africa and was dominated by production of cash crops. The second macro regime is what Amin referred to as Africa of the concession-owning companies, where private mining companies are given concessions to administer the territories and engage in extractive mining activities. Amin associated these macro regions with countries in the Congo River Basin, from Central African Republic to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Amin labeled the third macro region as Africa of the labor reserves, associated with settler colonial territories in East and Southern Africa, and the adjoining labor reserves from which the settler economies extracted migrant workers. Mkandawire's typology was concerned with identifying the labor reserves macro regions as being a social welfare regime that is distinct and separate from the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, especially different from the cash crop macro region, or what Samir Amin called Africa of the colonial trade economies. Mkandawire's social welfare typologies was also premised on an earlier work on regional differences in tax efforts. In other words, tax receipts as a share of GDP, which he said in many cases were actually colonial heritages. Southern African countries, he argued, demonstrate greater tax efforts than other regions. The classification method used by Mkandawire involved cluster analysis, which indicates that the trade, or what he calls cash crop economies, belong to a different cluster from the labor reserves. Mkandawire argued that the settler economies produced extensive welfare states initially intended for the settlers and administered on exclusively racial lines. But to quote him, which when deracialized, provided substantial benefits to those who now subsequently become included in this welfare system. In this regime, social expenditure is mostly funded from domestic resource mobilization. And in linking the regime types to tax efforts, Mkandawire argued that the inherited institutions for tax mobilization and welfare expenditure persisted into the post-settler context. The salient characteristics of the cash crop economies, Mkandawire argued, are that unlike in the labor reserve settler economies, land and production systems were left mainly in the hands of the indigenous population. Tax effort was limited to the collection of poll tax and trade tax levied on exports of cash crops. This spilled over into a significant informal economy and low welfare spending. Here, Mkandawire was referring to social protection spending. This would be similar to Sikim's agrarian welfare regimes. Applied to the health expenditure profile of the different regions, between cash crop macro region and the labor reserve macro region, Mkandawire argued that, I quote, labor reserve economies have much higher levels of payment for prepaid private plans than non-labor reserve economies, and hence have much less out-of-pocket expenditure as a percentage of private expenditure on health. Now, the classification generated in the efforts at creating typologies and taxonomies of welfare regimes is essential in making sense of the distinct clusters of normative and institutional underpinnings of welfare provisioning. Espen Anderson's welfare regime types, for instance, offer significant insights for policymakers in understanding specific types and implications of different welfare regimes, not merely as reflection of social stratification, but to the extent to which particular types of welfare regimes can reinforce or transform existing social stratification. However, typology construction is often limited by the social policy instruments that are included in the cluster analysis. As mentioned in Module 2, a limitation of Espen Anderson's typology is that it focuses almost exclusively on income maintenance and income replacement instruments. The danger is that quite often typology constructions tend to reduce social policy to social protection and then focus on those easily measurable transfers in cash in particular. While the scholars involved are aware of the broader social policy instruments, the methodological limitations might ignore important inflections of sub-levels of welfare provisioning. For instance, while the UK is classified within the liberal welfare regimes, its healthcare provisioning and institutional arrangement for healthcare through what is called the National Health Service are closer to the social democratic regime. For instance, concerning Africa, and then there are other issues where may completely ignore other important social policy instruments. So, for instance, concerning Africa, if we take on board the provision of health services, education services rather, the role of the state will be more extensive than typologies based on income maintenance schemes will suggest. In 1993, for instance, public spending on education in Madagascar was 51.5% of total education spending. In 1998, in the Benin Republic, public spending was 55.6%. In much of the 2000, household expenditure on education as a percentage of total spending on education was as low as 0.6% in Rwanda in 2005, 1.8% in Zambia 2004. And nowhere did household spending account for 44% or higher of total education spending. A further concern is that typologies tend to treat welfare arrangements, especially social democratic model, in what Joran Terbon described as a state of culmination and an endpoint in the development of a system of social welfare. Typologies are often derived from a snapshot picture of the welfare system as a specific moment in time. It will miss the evolution of the system beyond the particular moment in time. Social policy regimes can degrade or improve over time. These are almost always an outcome of contestation among social forces in society seeking to shape the system of welfare provisioning. Policymakers concerned with enhancing the well-being of their people have many lessons to learn in studying the evolution of a welfare regime as much as in understanding its shape at a specific moment in time. What social questions were the designers of a system trying to address? How did they seek to address the questions? What social forces were in contestation in shaping the eventual outcome of the welfare system? Above all, it is important to keep in mind that a social policy regime is subject to constant contestation and stress testing. Above all, it is essential to be aware of the diversity of social policy instruments available to policymakers, the diversity of funding, the delivery mechanisms, the diversity of coverage, generosity of provision, the nature of the social intention that shapes social policy architecture. The social policy instruments available to policymakers range from education to health, sanitation, housing, land and agrarian policies, labor markets, affirmative action, family policy, child support policy, old age policy, and so on and so forth. Every policy instrument intended to enhance well-being of people in a territory will count for social policy instruments. Even subsidies and prices of services in a manner that mitigates the vagaries of the market, such as pan-territorial pricing, will count as social policy instruments. It is equally important to be aware of the diversity of funding and delivery mechanisms for social welfare. The funding mechanisms range from tax-funded instruments to social insurance, individual private insurance, the use of sovereign wealth fund, out-of-pocket spending, to donor financing. But there are reverse directions for social policy financing mechanisms. For instance, social insurance between and different and distinct from market-based individual insurance in the area of pension fund, for example, can be the source of financing development activities and investments. For example, pension fund, we'll discuss this further, in Module 10. For example, pension fund, social insurance based, were used in Finland for financing national infrastructure in the 1950s. And in Korea, pension funds were used to finance the emerging industries, especially the chemical industry. What is essential to keep in mind is that the funding mechanism that becomes dominant will have consequences for the capacity of public authorities to mobilize the people for development purposes. It has implications for the nature of society that is being built. It has implications for whether the country is committing to a residual social policy architecture or to a more encompassing one. The delivery mechanism will also range from public institutions or publicly mandated bodies to market, family, or community. Again, the choice of delivery mechanism matters. It matters for resource mobilization, the capacity of public authorities to use the multiple tasks of social policies, and whether social policy can effectively contribute to the nation building or social cohesion projects of the country. Coverage matters in framing and delivering of social intention or social policy. Coverage that is universal or involves an essential universal provision with a second tier targeting to cover hard to reach groups and communities matters in the diverse tasks of social policy. Universal provisioning is more likely than not to underpin a social intention of social transformation and building social cohesion. These are important in the areas of education and healthcare service provision. The ability of a social policy instrument to reduce poverty rather than simply alleviate poverty is more a function of the generosity of the social provisioning than the simple act of providing. Poverty alleviation strategies are concerned with relief of poverty, although the total number in poverty may not reduce. A social assistance instrument that covers a fraction of the resources needed to meet basic consumption needs may alleviate poverty, but it cannot reduce it. Residual and stigmatizing systems of provision have tended to be inadequate for the beneficiaries and create resentment among non-beneficiaries whose taxes fund the social assistance. It is essential to be aware that funding mechanism, coverage levels, the generosity of provision, and the delivery mechanisms all affect social intention underpinning the social welfare system. It is the difference between a welfare system intended for system maintenance, just keeping the system going, another and another intended for social and economic transformation. Underpinning all this is the extent to which human worth and rights of people define the norms that frame the social policy architecture. To a significant extent, a social welfare regime reflects the social intention of the social actors that shape the design of the architecture. And this is important as we consider the implication of social welfare regime types for the COVID-19 pandemic. Much more, welfare regime types matter in understanding the capacity of a country to respond to external shocks, such as COVID-19 pandemic. A liberal or agrarian or populist welfare regime will have implications for the level of public investment in health infrastructure and the health surveillance capacity that precedes the pandemic. The social policy that is designed or designed intentionally to be residual and where public assistance is focused on those in extreme poverty is less likely to have in place the institutions necessary to respond to the adverse impact of the pandemic for life and livelihood. Residual social policy concerned with alleviating poverty among the extremely poor segment of the population tends to come with inadequate, what we call stingy, support and public provision. The institutional mechanism for the delivery of social welfare are likely to focus on the ultra poor. Often in such cases, social policy is stratified, segmented, and segregated. It is stratified in that even within the employment system, existing social stratification determines the size of the benefits that individuals receive. It is segmented in that different people belong to different small pools of resources available to deliver welfare. It is segregated in that public support is almost always reserved for the poor who can demonstrate that they are deserving of public support. Such social policy designs, which is precisely what has happened in much of Africa, cover over the last 30 years, is blind to those who are expected to provide for their own needs. They just are not visible to the system of public provision, social provision. In situations where, as in the case of COVID-19 pandemic, livelihood activities are disrupted, there are simply no institutional arrangements in place to mitigate the adverse impact of public health systems, such as restriction on public and economic activities or total or partial lockdown. This matters in much of the African context, where the informal economic activities are dominant. Informal economy and those employed within it may be legible to economic and labor market statisticians who compute the size of the informal sector in the national GDP or employment, but they are invisible for purposes of social welfare provisioning. The norms underpinning a country's welfare regimes also matter in the terms of the level of generosity, income replacement. This matters as much in the use of public social assistance schemes to relieve income loss during a pandemic. It matters as well in the use of unemployment insurance funds to support jobs and income during the pandemic. The norms of stingy residual social assistance will spill over into what public authorities considered sufficient support to mitigate income loss as a result of the pandemic. In the case of unemployment insurance, the level of pre-pandemic generosity of income replacement will frame the income replacement rate that will be in response to the adverse livelihood impact of the pandemic. Pre-pandemic health system investments, the modes of provisioning of healthcare, and the coverage of rules essential aspects of welfare regimes will matter in the response to the pandemic. For instance, a comprehensive public health system that is focused on adequacy and quality of healthcare provision is less likely to be suddenly confronted with inadequate hospital beds at relatively low levels of hospitalization from the new coronavirus, or face a shortage of healthcare workers. Now, at high levels of infection rate and hospitalization, yes, there may be problems, but at low levels, which is what many African countries outside of South Africa, the second wave experienced, it should not be a problem. This is taken into consideration that an essential public health measure in controlling the pandemic was to avoid the infection cases rising to the point where they overwhelm the health system. Still, the capacity of the healthcare system is a matter of pre-pandemic investment in the healthcare system, in the health system. Equally important is that a social policy regime that is underpinned by the norms of solidarity, enhancement of equality, and based on universal access to welfare, social welfare services, and benefit is more likely to deepen social cohesion in society. It is likely to build trust between public authorities and society and within different components of society. Social cohesion matters in the way in which the norms of the collective well-being and concerns for the well-being of others in one society can help to frame how people in a society trust and respond to public health measures intended to control the pandemic. In other words, it is not merely a case of funds and resources to control the pandemic. Public trust and the other regarding norms, in other words, norms that values the welfare of others, are essential aspects of how public authorities and society manage the response to the pandemic. Finally, pre-pandemic investment in education and a country's national system of innovation, research and development capacity will matter in the capacity to respond to the requirements of addressing the pandemic. A country's ability to produce test kits and reagents, for instance, is a function of pre-pandemic investment in the education system and its national system of innovation. The development component of the synergy with social policy also matters in terms of the manufacturing capacity of a country. The capacity has direct relevance to whether a country has sufficient productive capacity to produce what is needed to respond to the pandemic, or it will remain dependent on importing materials it needs, especially the ones requiring high-tech production capacity. Much of the social policy systems that have been sold to Africa in the last 30 years have been woefully inadequate in deepening the quality of human well-being or creating structural transformation in its economies and societies. Thank you.